All right, I am Laurel Marr, and this is Naomi, who is a part of the Death and Resurrection Doula Training Program. And she has a license as a funeral director, and she's very educated on some of the emerging trends in burial that, as a death doula, you will likely come across. You may get questions from the families you're working with. So this is going to be a introduction, and we can certainly have more conversations on it in the future. Naomi, thank you for offering your time and your wisdom and knowledge. So I'm going to let you talk with us about home funerals and green funerals.
Thank you. I am actually a licensed midwife as well as a licensed funeral director in California. Um, so my passion is to see families become aware of their options for green funerals and also home funerals. Um, Many years ago, prior to the wars, World War I and World War II, families took care of their own dead. When their loved one passed away, they helped prepare the body. Often they would have areas of land if they had acreage, and they would bury their loved ones on their own land. They took care of all the cleansing and the shrouding and the casketing and made homemade coffins and homemade caskets to take care of their loved ones. Um, Around the time of World War I and World War II, when soldiers were away from their homes and away from their families, and they had mass casualties, and they had to find ways to take care of the deceased, these funeral homes started to pop up, and then the funeral industry really began to take off. And embalming became a process because families wanted to see their loved ones before they were put in the ground and no longer around. And so they came up with all this technology to preserve the body, and then they just created this whole industry, this whole funeral industry, which is a billion-dollar industry, multi-billion-dollar industry. Um, so there is this trend that's been coming forward from a lot of death care workers that are in the community, um, to have go back to the ways that we used to do care of our deceased. And one of them that is really up and coming is the home funeral movement, which we talked about in one of our earlier videos about how to take care of the body at home. A lot of people don't realize they actually have the legal right to be with their loved one during the death process. They don't realize that they can keep their loved one at home for a number of days. There are definitely things you have to pay attention to: temperature, making sure that the body is preserved in a cool enough environment. Um, but you don't have to get your loved one to a funeral home right away. In our culture, we tend to brush death under the rug, and it's the body is scary, and somebody has to come and take it away and get it over to the funeral home, and we don't get to really have tangible closure of the death process when someone passes. So a lot of families are interested in learning about how to become more involved, how to be the family that transports their loved one to the funeral home at their own time when they're ready to let their loved one go, um, and how to how to bury their loved one in a way that isn't full of embalming chemicals. It's not good for the environment. A lot of those chemicals leach into the land. The use of burial vaults over prolonged, it's just not sustainable with the number of people that are going to die, which is 100% of the population. We just don't have the land to maintain the traditional modern funeral practices that we do. So there are places erupting. Washington State is a huge driver in the green burial movement. They've approved the natural organic reduction. They've approved water cremation. Washington and Colorado have been doing it for quite some time. And a lot of families are really liking this idea of being able to bury their loved one and have their loved one give back to their land, give back to the family in a way that traditional burial methods don't typically allow. Um, Washington has big preserve area where they do the natural organic reduction. It's in a great big forested area. They can do a green burial, or they can do the organic reduction process. So I'll try to break down what those two different processes look like. Um, the natural organic reduction is the decedent is shrouded in a biodegradable shroud. So cotton, bamboo, any items like flowers, their favorite whiskey, notes, messages can all be placed with the body, and the body is placed in a pod on a bed of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And it's an oxygenated pod where they do their little memorial service. They push their loved one in, place their loved one into the pod. It gets closed up, and over the course of a month, it gets rotated about 1 or 2 times to distribute the moisture. And the body completely breaks down into a nutrient dense soil. The average person will yield about 1.5 yards of soil. So after the 1 month process, they open it up, they remove any larger bone fragments or teeth that might not have gotten fully broken down. They dehydrate and cremulate those just like they would cremulate the bones from the crematory, the fire cremation. They cremulate those and add it back into the soil. It adds calcium to the soil. The soil cures for a month. The family can come and pick it up. They can take all of that soil home, or they can take a portion of it and donate the rest to land conservation projects. So there's stream restoration projects, land conservation, but that soil is nutrient dense soil. The laws in the states that have approved natural organic reduction do say that you should not grow tomatoes out of that soil, that it would be more for a tree or for a memorial flower garden. They don't recommend growing any food for human consumption from that soil, which really doesn't make any sense. I mean, the farmer throws the cow into the compost, it breaks down and then grows the vegetables that we eat. How is grandma any different? But I think it's a mindset for a lot of people that they just don't want to have food associated with it. So we do encourage people to consider doing, a memorial flower garden or a memorial tree in honor of their loved one. And I know in Washington, they've had some invasive species that are taking over, plant species that are taking over the streams and inhibiting the salmon runs. And so families that can't take all the soil or have no desire to take the soil can donate it to these conservation projects. And they're using that soil to re-nourish the earth as they grow native species in to help the wildlife in the area as well. So it's kind of a beautiful way to give back. The water process is also another green method that is available. The water cremation process that's right now currently approved in these states is called alkaline hydrolysis. And it's basically 95% water to 5% alkaline. And through heat and motion, the body all the soft tissue is completely reduced to a nutrient dense liquid. There is one water cremation facility in the state of California right now. It's called White Rose Aqua Cremation in Escondido, California. A few others are popping up. It again is a green option. The body breaks down within a matter of 4 to 6 hours. And what is left behind is pure white bone. It's so clean, it is so sterile that you will often see the people that are working the crematory, they'll open up the vault and without gloves, they'll just pick up the bones. Everything is perfectly sterile. The little identification tags that they put with your loved one when they're doing any cremation process, those ID tags come out perfectly clean. It's quite amazing. And any implants that are in there as well. And same thing with the natural organic reduction. Implants are taken out and properly recycled, which is actually a step up from even a green burial. in the sense that any implants in a green burial are left behind in the body and leach into the soil over time, whereas these are properly recycled. The other interesting thing about the water cremation is, unlike a fire cremation where you're left with a gray charred bone that might have other elements of the cremation process in it, you end up with a really white bone. You end up with 30% more ash as well, with your loved one at the end of it. With the water process, they take those bones out, they dehydrate them, and then they cremulate them, and that becomes the ash that you can take home in an urn, or you could do a green burial at sea in a biodegradable urn. The family, some people will do what are called living stones, where they can take that ash, and they can do this with regular cremation ash as well, but they press it into a dense stone, and you could have, like, I don't know, a dozen stones or 2 dozen stones that then you can give away to your family members. That's a keepsake of the loved one as well. There is a unit that's in process right now. It's called the FC 600, and it is in the process of getting approved for California. I think they're hoping to have it done this year. I hope that happens because it's actually a superior unit. The current unit from BioResponse Solutions, that's the name of the company, the one that is approved in many of the states, it requires like 300 gallons of water, quite a bit of water. And the bigger the person is, the more water that's going to be required. Whereas this particular unit that's in process, it has a bit of a different chemical component when it breaks down the body, but it only uses 60% of the decedent's body weight in water. And not only that, the water goes back into a fully contained system that is a nutrient-dense liquid that is just peptides, amino acids, sugars, and salts. There's no DNA in it, and that can be used as a natural organic fertilizer for farmers that are growing non-human consumption crops. That water can be donated again to land restoration projects like you would with the soil, or the family can take a portion or all of that water home and do a memorial tree or a garden for their loved one as well. So the ash can also be added as calcium if you wanted to nourish your plants if needed. So there's all kinds of green options that are coming onto the horizon. There's also burial at sea. There's one woman in California, she rents out a ship. It's like a $7,000 or $8,000 process. And they rent this ship. It takes you out to you have to go a certain distance at sea to bury, and they put weights, they put them in a biodegradable shroud. They tie weights onto the loved one, and they can actually bury them at sea. They put them overboard and have their burial ceremony at sea. That's another option as well. Something to keep in mind with the natural organic reduction that is different than the water cremation. The natural organic reduction cannot handle or do anything with an embalmed body. So if there's embalming chemicals in the body, you cannot do natural organic reduction. However, with the water cremation process, you can. So if you are embalmed, you can still have that green option available to you.
I have a couple quick questions that just popped up. What's the cost of at this point? And I know this might be California based, but costs for the natural reduction and the water cremation, how do they compare to a cremation?
Yeah, so a standard fire cremation can be as low as $600 to $800 if you have just the direct cremation process. Now, counting your transport fees and all of the other things that can be associated with it. But water cremation right now in Escondido runs at about, I want to say it's about 3,000 to 6,000. So it's significantly less than a water or than a traditional burial, which can run you tens of thousands of dollars.
Exactly. Right.
It's very, very expensive. A green burial runs about 6,000. And that would be a green burial would be going to a preserve where the loved one is actually only buried about, I think they say it's like 3 to 4 feet depth because they want the oxygen to help break down the body.
Mm,
Um, Unlike a traditional burial where you're, well, the joke is 6 to 8 feet under, right?
6 feet
So
under.
it's 6 feet under, yeah.
Mm,
So they bury you more shallow in a preserved area so that the nature can run its course.
hmm.
Um, where was I going with that? Just lost my train of thought here.
Well, you said that that's about
Oh, the cost.
6,000.
Cost.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah, so that can run about 5 to 6 thousand, and then of
Hmm.
course the natural organic reduction, the going rate because it is a longer process, is more like 8,000 or
Hmm.
more.
And as these become
And
more
it is a 2 month
popular,
wait process.
so what
Hmm.
do they do
It
with the
is
body while they wait? Because you can't embalm. So the body has to stay in a fridge at the funeral
it
home,
has
or
to
they
be
have a place.
refrigerated. Yeah,
Yeah,
so these places are actually full-fledged funeral
right,
homes. They
right,
have the
right, right.
refrigeration units. Um, and yeah, they just
Mm,
they
right.
stay in the fridge until they're ready. And they can be at any process of decomposition for the process to work.
Yeah,
Ideally, you're not,
true.
having to wait too long, but
Right.
if you had to, as
So,
long as there's
so
no embalming chemicals, you're fine.
really interesting. When I lived out west, you're out west, you're in California. When I lived out west in Colorado, um, we had a horse that needed to be put down, and we looked at our different options. You can shoot the horse. I mean, it's like
Hmm.
being very blunt. You could have a vet, euthanize the horse. But if that is what happens, if you end up euthanizing the horse, the chemicals that are in that, you have to bury your you either have to do it at the landfill, because and then the horse
Mm.
gets covered, or you have to bury your animal like very deep if you were going to do it at home, which is possible if you live on property.
Hmm.
But all of this is because the nature, the critters such as foxes
Hmm.
and hawks
Yeah.
and all that, like they want to protect you know animals from
Hmm. The
ingesting the
chemicals.
chemicals, right? So I mean, a horse, it's not a human being, but I would think that, all of this still plays a role, is that we have to protect
Hmm.
nature, through,
Yeah.
greening
Yeah.
up these options. And I don't
Hmm.
know, this isn't really what you and I intended to talk about today, but even the medical aid in dying, right? If someone ends up
Yeah.
going that route, I'm sure they've thought about this, but the
Hmm.
chemo drugs, like I'm just wondering if any of that affects the wildlife, if yeah, but I guess it wouldn't really
Yeah.
matter because bodies will be buried. But just all of that
Hmm.
is to me fascinating. We used to we used to say, maybe we've been saying, you began your conversation today with talking about embalming. It preserved the body so that families could
Hmm.
see their loved ones, and we look at that as a positive thing, as a form of grief care, right? If they
Right.
can see their body, their loved one as as alive as possible, through the
Hmm.
embalming process. If they didn't, it would be hard to put closure to the loss of someone,
Yeah.
particularly a soldier in the Civil War, right? Traveling,
Right. Yeah.
killed far away from home, and not being able
Hmm.
to see that person. But now we're shifting a bit away from what we used at that time to,
Right.
help our grief. And now we're beginning to, now then we turn that into, well, let's just let the funeral home take the body and deal with it. And now we're
Hmm.
like, well, we're taking it back. So our methods of caring for our grief are changing, and not with natural, like you know early times, they didn't have the process of fire cremation that we have. We have
Right.
new emerging forms as well, but particularly this caring for the body at home,
Hmm.
having a home funeral. Let's talk about that a little bit. You said, when we were just chatting off the recording that, if someone decides to keep the body at home and wash the
Mhm.
body, prepare the body, follow all the necessary steps for keeping that body, on ice, and, all the necessary steps for preventing the decomposition. And they want to have a funeral at home. Parlors, which were, in many homes, they were constructed to provide a place for families to have
Yeah,
funerals at home. So let's say
that's right.
someone decides to take as much of this into their hands as possible, and they
Right.
want to do do the preparation at home, have a funeral. They could transport the body right to a preserve. And
They
the
could. You have to check the laws of each
Mhm.
state, because I think there are some states, I can't tell you which ones because I don't know, but I think there are some states that actually have it in the law that only a funeral director or transport company is able to transport the decedent.
Okay,
So you
right,
have to know what the laws are in your state. In California,
right,
surprisingly, with all the regulations we have, it's pretty darn lax around here. You can do almost
right,
anything.
right.
And you
Yeah.
even have the legal right to, if you can get the permit set up, you could actually bury your loved one on your property if you have the space for it.
Hmm. Wow. Right.
So,
Yes,
for people to know they have that right to,
right.
that, their
That's what
loved one
made,
belongs to them, not to the state.
well, that's what made me bring up the story about the horse, right? Because we looked at that
Right.
option. It's like,
Yeah.
well, we
Yeah.
would love to maybe have our animals, because we had horses and dogs, and we did bury one dog on the property. We didn't,
Yeah.
and we talked about looking into doing it for ourselves had we stayed there. But no,
Hmm.
it's been years, and we don't own that property anymore. But I think that, yeah, probably, out west is certainly, they're willing to try things maybe more before
Yeah.
some of the urban, East Coast areas. But
Yeah.
so let's talk about, I shared with you as well, we did a green funeral for my dad,
Hmm.
but we didn't bury in a preserve. He's buried in a local cemetery here. And you and I were
Yeah.
just, you asked me, well, what is it that made it a green burial? And this is, what I was told by the funeral home. So we didn't have my dad embalmed, but we had the option of choosing a green embalming fluid. We
Hmm.
didn't want a public viewing. It just, the family sat with him, and so it wasn't necessary. Saved quite a bit of
Yeah.
money. But the
Yes.
casket we chose was, all biodegradable materials. The wood itself,
Right.
all of the interior lining,
Mhm.
and so, so those choices that we picked, they said, well, this is, effectually a green funeral, and we were happy with
Hmm.
it. I don't really, I mean, granted, we might have, saved some on the embalming, but we didn't save huge money because, we did a
Right.
green funeral. Plots are expensive. It all adds
Hmm.
up,
It does.
very, very much. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of people probably choose their method of disposition based on
Based on cost.
based on the cost. And some people
Yeah.
will do that direct cremation, that's $600 to eight hundred
Hmm.
dollars, have the body in an
Yeah.
urn, because
Hmm.
that is least taxing on the family, right?
Yeah. So I know in California, it is illegal to tell somebody that they have to get their loved one embalmed because it's not the law here.
Right.
Um, and I think that's actually law in a lot of states,
I think
from
it
my
is.
understanding.
Yeah.
Um, so a green burial could be as simple as doing the direct fire cremation and having the ash put in a biodegradable urn. That could be considered a green
You're
burial,
right.
which is actually what a green burial is marketed here in our area, because there is
Mhm.
no water cremation in this area. There is no natural
Interesting.
organic reduction yet.
Right. Right.
So natural organic reduction got voted into law in I think around the end of 2023, but it's not going to be active in law until 2027.
Interesting.
So it's not actually
Interesting.
happening here yet. I know
Hmm.
CANA, which is the Cremation Association of North America, they are actually now starting to put out educational crematory training for natural organic reduction,
Hmm.
which is really exciting. Um, So something going back to the chemicals in the body. So if somebody's gone through chemotherapy, what happens in that process? What's it doing to that soil? Believe it or not, in both the water and the soil processes, those elements are completely um, they're completely
Rid
obliterated.
of,
There's
right,
no
right.
DNA. All the chemical
Uh-huh.
compounds of the medications are no longer there in the breaking down process. The bacteria
Okay.
do their job and take care of it.
Wow.
However, embalming fluid is too artificial and it's just not going to work.
Right,
I'd be
right.
curious. I have to look into whether or not the green
Fascinating.
burial, the green embalming, if that would work for natural organic reduction or not.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if it
Interesting.
would.
Well,
Yeah.
it interesting trends to follow in the lesson
Yeah.
for funerals and burial trends. I include some links. One of them is to the National Home Funeral Alliance, but
Hmm.
also something we didn't talk about today, but there's a little discussion about it in the background of this experience is that you can actually take cremated remains from fire cremation and have them turned
Hmm.
into a diamond or a
Yes, you
vinyl
can.
record,
Hmm. Yep.
do things with that. So we have a lot of
Yep.
options.
Lots of
I know
options.
I've said this in the last video we did together and, said it in class too, but I find like, well, at this point, the Catholic Church it seems to be they're frowning upon the reduction, the material reduction at this point. You made the comment to me,
Mm-hmm.
well, they used to frown upon, fire cremation, which is true. And
Hmm.
and a lot of people they struggle with the type of disposition they choose. They do. They struggle with it. A lot of
Oh,
people
it's
think
hard. Yeah.
that just the burial is the way that, we need to go
Yeah.
because Jesus is going to come back. And my personal opinion on it, which does not necessarily need to, influence another, is that is, I, you know, education about things is always
Hmm.
fine, right, and safe.
Yeah.
I just encourage people to make sure their families that they work with know your salvation is not predicated on how we
How you're
dispose of a
buried.
body, right?
Yeah.
Because and the reason I say this
Yeah.
is not because I think Christians don't know that, but it's because the secular side of the death positive movement, which celebrates these emerging trends because they're
Yeah.
green, we can save the planet, like all
Yeah.
of those. As Christians, we're here to be stewards of the creation, like for sure,
Absolutely.
but we're
Hmm.
not going to give back to the earth in a means that produces a salvation for us. And that, like,
Right.
I
It
think
doesn't
that's
become our
just,
salvation.
which that's not something that the death positive movement is going to incorporate into the
Hmm.
development of more green options. Is that we're constantly, as human beings caught in sin, looking for ways to justify and to save ourselves. And as
Hmm.
long as our families that we work with understand, choosing this method or this method, or even saying, I have to have the regular, burial method because there's salvation in that, right? No matter what
Right.
they are, our justification in Jesus Christ is not based on burial or funeral. God's not angry at us because we paid this much for our funeral or when we had this option. But I do think in grief, these things go
Hmm.
through our head, like and
Yeah.
so our knowledge of end of life doulas around all of these topics and around
Hmm.
salvation can help families feel at ease
Yeah.
with their choices and end of life planning. And even if it's someone said, I really don't want to do a direct cremation, but I can't afford anything else. It's
Yeah.
okay. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of funeral homes, I don't think people realize will actually work with families. If they're really struggling and they're having a hard time paying those bills, they have the ability to help those families do what needs to be done at a cost they can afford.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Going back to the Christian perspective and stewards, in the birth world, we don't mess around. We ideally don't mess around with the birth process. We want things to be, and that sort of touches on the maid issue as well. We don't mess around with that process because we're missing something. And it's it's my thought as a believer, and it's part of being a steward of God's creation, is God designed our body to break down in a specific way, and it's very efficient.
Hmm.
And when we pump the body full of all these chemicals, not only is it harming the land that God gave us, but it's inhibiting the process
Right.
of
That's a
how
great
He
point.
designed our bodies to break down. So I see this movement as a way to honor the way the Lord has already designed our body to do the work it's going to do after it's gone. And it was designed to feed the land, and
Hmm.
that's what it's going to do. And so and God is not limited. You know, people think, oh, I can't scatter my loved one's ashes because in the resurrection, God's not going to know
Mm.
what to do. I
Right.
mean,
God's not limited.
he spoke everything out of nothing. And he's not going to have any problem picking up grandma who was scattered through a lake somewhere. I mean, that's
Right.
not going to
Well,
be a
and lots of
problem for the
bodies
Lord.
become dismembered and parts aren't found,
Or
right? You know?
exactly. The
Right.
Lord is gonna, I look forward to seeing what that day is gonna look like when he
Mm.
brings up his bride. But
Oh.
it's he designed our bodies to break down a certain way, and I just my passion is to see us honor what the Lord has designed, and we can do it. And it's also psychological for a lot of families. Like I can even speak to a personal story of a friend who tragically lost their grandchild. And the mom was adamant that she didn't want her baby buried in a dark hole in the ground. And dad was like, I'm not putting my baby through fire. And fortunately, in the state they lived in, they were able to find the water cremation. And that was a lot easier for them
Mm.
mentally in their grieving process than the other options that were out there.
Mm.
So I
Wow.
think just people knowing what their options are. I was always personally really scared of fire cremation. I never wanted that. Now I don't care. I'm like,
Mhm.
whatever. I'm a vessel,
Right.
and the Lord's gonna
Hmm.
resurrect the body, and that will be wonderful. And it doesn't matter how it happens. But I think psychologically, fire is really traumatizing for a lot of people.
Mm.
And so to
Hmm.
have the option of more gentle methods is really good for
Right.
them psychologically as they grieve as well.
Mm. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, and
Yeah,
you
it's
can
fun.
keep us updated,
Yeah.
updated at some point too. So, all right, I'm going to end the
Yeah.
recording.